Welcome to another Your Brain On series where we hear from our brilliant neuroscientist at Conscious Works about how our brain responds to different phenomenons and theories. And today is resilience, which is kind of this buzzword that's really been thrown around for the last year. So really getting to the heart of it. And by that, I mean talking more about what's happening biologically in your body, to your immune system, to your brain, and having a little bit of a different understanding of it. Just quickly, I'm the CEO of Conscious Works, which is a consulting company that looks at the skills, habits, and work design for proactive mental health and performance. So really how we come to work. We offer everything from webinars to keynotes to full on support with our resilience roadmap, which we'll talk about at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our brilliant resident neuroscientist who is weeks away from his PhD that I'm giving him so much. Like, how do you celebrate? Actually, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. How do you celebrate somebody getting their PhD during a pandemic? Creative ideas accepted. Yeah, so without further ado, Ty, take it away.
Awesome. And then one quick qualifier on the PhD celebration. I found it's going to be on a Monday, so it's a celebration on Monday above all else.
A Monday during a
Uh,
pandemic. How?
yeah. All right. But to the topic at hand, today we're going to learn about resilience. So this talk was actually inspired to be a follow-up from the one we did last week, which was all about your brain on burnout. That's because a lot of the same concepts that are involved in burnout are also playing resilience. And whereas burnout has some negative connotations, resilience is a much more optimistic term. So let's dive into exactly what this buzzword that we've all heard so much about over the last year is about and how we can put a little bit more of it into our daily life. So there's actually a really good analogy between resilience in our brain and resilience in our immune system. So I figure for us to get acquainted with what exactly resilience means conceptually, we could do a little bit of a pop quiz and see how much we collectively know about the immune system. We've all been in a global pandemic for the last year, and I'm pretty sure you've learned a little bit about white blood cells over that time. So let's see. Just going to be a series of multiple choice questions that'll be put up on the screen. There's multiple correct answers. So please just put the letters that you think are the correct responses into the chat, and then we'll see where we get. So first question, number one, our immune system provides us with protection from which of the following? A, bacteria, B, viruses, C, parasites, or D, our microbiome. Remember, there can be multiple correct responses. Got a little bit of variability. Some people are picking a couple of them. A couple people did all. A lot of single ones. All right. So this one's actually just a slight little bit of a trick question in the sense it's all of the above. So our immune system is able to protect us from a wide array of different pathogens that have the potential to harm our body. In the same way that resilience in our brain can protect us from a wide array of adverse events. So a bit of a similarity there. All right, so next question. So which of the following is a viable strategy for developing a healthy immune system? A, we don't have to worry about it because we have an innate immune system. B, we can use vaccines to acquire immunity. C, we can isolate ourselves from pathogens. And D, we can acquire immunity after exposure to pathogens. Yeah, everyone seems to be very fond of all of these responses. So let's see what the correct answer is. Da, 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 da. It's actually all but C. So our immune system is kind of interesting in the sense that it actually needs to be challenged in order to properly function. So while isolating ourselves from pathogens can help us not have to experience the consequence of that particular pathogen, it actually doesn't help us out for developing immunity for that pathogen itself. So it's all about kind of exposure within reasonable healthy grounds. So congratulations to everyone who identified all of them but C. All right, next one. Which of the following is true about acquired immunity as opposed to innate immunity? So A, that it uses the same white blood cells as innate immunity. B, that it can fade over time. C, that it can be compromised in older age, as well as certain health conditions such as AIDS. And D, that it's usually pathogen specific. All right, so let's see what the answers are. So it's actually all but A. So So this is getting into just a little bit of a technical detail in that there's different classifications of white blood cells that, go through acquired versus innate immunity. But the more broad issue that I want to get at is actually in what the correct answers were, the ones that are highlighted in blue. The fact that our immune system resilience can fade over time, in the sense that we develop for a particular pathogen, but it actually evolve. The pathogen can change over time, and we can lose our ability to be protected from it. And that a lot of health conditions that we might have can compromise our immune system's ability to perform those functions. So there's an intimate relationship between the resilience of our immune system with our overall global health. And last question, which of the following could lead to lower immunity? So we got A, poor diet, B, burnout, C, a lack of physical activity, and D, meditation. So the correct answer is all but D. There's actually a little bit of evidence that meditation might be able to boost your immunity a little bit. Not the strongest evidence, so it's a little tenuous, but the other ones there's quite a bit more support for that if you have a poor diet, that if you're experiencing a lot of burnout, or if that you don't regularly have a lot of physical activity in your lifestyle, that those can all lead towards a less well-functioning immune system. So congratulations, everyone forgot the correct answers. And if you didn't get the correct answers, hopefully you learned something along the process. That's the important thing. Now that we're all kind of up to date on exactly what resilience is as it means for the immune system, hopefully this makes it a little bit easier for us to understand what resilience means as it relates to our brain. So the first core idea that I want to get at is this idea of adaptability. You might have caught with one of those questions. There's a difference between our innate immune system versus our acquired immune system. So our acquired immune system is all about adapting to new pathogens and being able to deal with the new ones as they come in. For example, a particular virus that seems to be all around the world right now. The next big commonality that I want to really draw up is this idea of anti-fragility. So that's a little bit of an odd term, so I want to unpack that just a little bit. So we've all probably heard the term fragile, meaning that it's very easy to break. Think about, porcelain dolls and the dinner plates that you keep in cupboards. And you can contrast with something that's durable, something that doesn't easily break, like good old-fashioned cars. They can take a beating and keep going. And then that's contrast with this idea of anti-fragile, meaning that when you actually put it under stress, it actually becomes stronger. So that's the idea from our immune system, is that we need to be exposed to pathogens within some degree of like healthy circumstances in order to build up our immunity. And the same thing actually is true as it relates to resilience within our brain. The more that we experience stress as part of our ongoing life, the more we kind of become build up our resilience for being able to handle stress when it occurs later on in our life. So there's actually a potential that a lot of people that may have, responded the best to the COVID-19 pandemic are the ones that have already been, dealing with a lot of change and potentially some degree of stress within their life. So it wasn't as much of a world-changing thing for them as it might have been for some other people. Um, and something that goes along with that is this idea that the memory of our resilience can fade. So with our immune system, that's quite literal in the sense that pathogens can change and the immunity that we build up is no longer valid. It doesn't work anymore over time. But the important thing we want to get at this is that we need constantly to be exercising our resilience in order to maintain it. It's not something that you can just develop once, put on the shelf, and pull it out after 5 years when the next global pandemic comes around or what have you. It's something that we need to actively be exercising on an ongoing basis. And then the final piece is the fact that our resilience can be compromised by poor health conditions. And this really just gets the fact that all of our body systems, our organ systems are intimately related, and the functioning of one can relate to the functioning of others. So hopefully that illustrated how resilience is somewhat similar between the immune system within our brain to give us a little bit of a better understanding exactly what resilience is. And how this follows up from the talk that we had last week is basically the last year's kind of been a bit of a dumpster fire. I selected this GIF pretty intentionally. And when we experience these really hard periods of stress and turmoil, they can lead to one of two different outcomes. We can either get burnout, which we talked about a lot last month, or it can lead us towards resilience, in which we rise up to the challenge to become a better version of ourselves. So the question that we're all probably in this the webinar should talk about is how do we make that switch from going from burnout to resilience? Given that we're all kind of forced into this dumpster fire, how can we make the best of this opportunity so that it becomes a source of personal growth as opposed to something that becomes a detriment to our health. So just to quickly go over that, just in case people weren't available for the last month, I just want to do a quick brief refresher for the body's physiological response to stress. So there's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. It's a little bit easier to say, and this is our body's main hormonal response to stress. So when we experience some sort of a stress, whether or not it's something that happened at work, we got a new task delivered to us, we got some bad news, we had a breakup with our romantic partner, this all gets triggered within our brain, and it causes a cascade of different hormones to be released from our body, starting first from our hypothalamus, then from our pituitary gland, and then finally cortisol, our primary stress hormone, is released from our adrenal gland. And then this gets released into our bloodstream and has a lot of different effects all throughout our body. And under normal circumstances, there's what's called a negative feedback in place, meaning that the release of cortisol actually inhibits its own release. So this allows the homeostasis to happen. And this is depicted in the top right there of the diagram. So you can see with that first figure, when you experience stress, your cortisol is initially going to shoot up and it's going to change in which your body and brain is functioning. But then after a period of time, it's actually going to decrease and go back down to a baseline level. And there's going to be this cyclicity, this cyclic nature to our experience of stress. But unfortunately, over the last year, what's been happening is we haven't been given the opportunity for that full recovery, in the sense that we just kind of have one thing thrown at us after another, and we're not able to get that recovery. And as a result, our cortisol is able to go back down to the baseline. So our baseline is actually becoming more of a floating baseline where it's constantly increasing. And this can start to cause a whole bunch of broader health problems. So when we start to get these chronic levels of psychological stress, it actually impairs that negative feedback process that allows cortisol to be homeostatic and auto-regulate. So then we can get runaway cortisol ramping throughout our body, or we can get exhaustion where we don't have enough cortisol when we actually do need it. And this can lead to a whole bunch of different negative health outcomes. It can lead to high blood pressure, which can put us at risk for different kinds of heart disease and stroke. It can lead towards high blood sugar, which can put us at risk for diabetes. It can also lead to inflammatory issues within our digestive system, so inflammatory bowel disease, as well as the weakened immune system, which might be important as we're really talking about trying to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, or attention difficulties. So these are all the health consequences that can come from burnout and stress taking its toll chronically upon us. So then the question then becomes, how do we take that source of stress that we've all been experiencing over the last year and transform that into resilience? That's kind of the magic question of the day that I'm guessing everyone is in this webinar to learn about. While there are a couple things we can do in it generally, what I first want to talk about is the fact that there's multiple different ways that we can potentially go to resilience. So I just want to give one example of how there's different paths that we can get there. And this actually comes from the research on trauma. So when I was first started learning about the brain around 10 years ago, I was introduced what's called the Diathesis stress model. And it basically separated people into those that are hardy, those that are resilient, and those who are not. And what classified you as being a dandelion and being resilient or not was a combination of your genes and your early life experiences. So your genes, obviously, you inherit from your parents. There's nothing you can really do to change that. And your early life experiences, you don't have as much control over that either. And there's this interaction between the two, where if you have particular genes and you have certain adverse childhood experiences, this can predispose you to not be resilient. And this is the way that we thought about it for the longest time. So basically, if you weren't a dandelion, you're kind of SOL. And that's not a very optimistic way to really think about the problem. But over the last decade so, there's been a lot of research into an alternative way to think about this problem, referred to as the biological sensitivity to context model. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it kind of keeps with this nice flower analogy. So up on the screen here, you can see the difference between those that are resilient and those that are not resilient, with the resilient ones being depicted as the dandelion there. So on this graph, you can see that stress is on the x-axis. So on the left-hand side, that's where you have low stress. And on the right-hand side, that's where you have high stress. And then we've got some sort of pathology on the y-axis, meaning that the more stress that you experience, the more likely you're going to have those negative health outcomes that I was describing on the previous slide. So the high blood pressure, the high blood sugar, the mental health problems, what have you. And the way that we used to think about this problem is that if you're a resilient person, it didn't really matter how much stress you're exposed to, you're probably going to turn out all right. So you might cross that magical threshold where you can get diagnosed with a condition, but it's a lot less likely than if you're the solid line where you're not resilient. But where this model really kind of flips things on its head is it looks and expands what happens when we not only have an absence of stress, we have a supportive environment. And we see that there's actually a whole nother area dynamics that's going on here. And the way that we can really think about these people is like orchids. So I can't take credit for the flower analogy that actually comes from some Scandinavians. But anyone that's tried to take care of orchids knows that these are really delicate flowers. If you look at them the wrong way, there's a good chance they might die. I personally have not been able to take care of orchids. I'm just getting up to ferns after graduating from succulents. If you happen to be really good at taking care of these orchids and you can be really sensitive to the pH of the soil, you have these very beautiful flowers that can bloom and manifest as a result of this. And that's the way that you can kind of think about it as it relates to this. So here now we've labeled our orchids within this graph, and we can see that when stress is high, our orchid people, they're much more likely to experience all those pathologies that we were previously talking about. But the difference being that if they're in very low stress circumstances, in fact, where there's a supportive environment, they actually thrive substantially more than the dandelion people. So where the dandelion people are going to be kind of good all the time, we need to be a lot more thoughtful about the environment that these orchid people are operating within so they can really achieve their full potential, because they have a lot more potential we might not be realizing if the circumstances just really aren't in a good position for them. And to kind of keep with the flower analogy, we can think about it as it's all about the soil as to what's going to really make a difference between whether someone's resilient or not. So, and I really like this framing because it means it's less about the individual person and what they can't necessarily change about themselves. We can change our genes and we can change what happened to us during our childhoods. So we really don't have as much of a choice on whether we're a dandelion or an orchid. But that doesn't mean that we all can't be resilient. And if we can, have good soil that us as, using a flower analogy, have good soil to grow in, this can lead towards cultivating that resilience. So now, Lisa, I'll get you to prepare the breakout rooms because we got our first interactive activity of the afternoon. So last week I talked about how there's these 6 contributors to burnout. So these are things that tend to be a little bit more systemic. They're a little bit more the function of groups. Um, so last time we introduced this idea, but now I want to think about how could we specifically think about these differently between orchid versus dandelion people. So how can we think about managing our team's workload as it relates to providing the proper support for orchid people? So we'll join into the breakout rooms and just think about these 6 different contributors to burnout and how at a systemic, as a group level, as leaders within our field, we can try to reorganize things to be supportive to not just the dandelions, but also the orchids. So we can really get that full bloom out of everyone. Okay. Oh, we have a question. Could people be both? That's actually a good question in the sense that in different areas of life, you can actually potentially have that. So, for example, maybe you're, more of a dandelion when it comes to, physical labor kind of stuff. When it comes to intellectual things, you're a little bit more of an orchid, and you need a lot of support for like those different kinds of tasks. All right. So we'll keep going on. So I had one other topic that I wanted to get through. So now we've got a little bit of an appreciation how there's not necessarily a one size fits all approach to cultivating resilience out of stress. That being said, I'm going to present one of the more universal things based on the way that our brain is wired that can somewhat be a universal strategy. And it relates to the concept of neuroplasticity. So we've all probably seen motivational posters like this before. Where it's like, get a new mindset and this can, produce new results. There's been lots of books like The Secret that have all been based on the idea that if you change the way that you think about the problem, that it can change the way in which the world manifests around yourself. And to the extent that any of those are true, neuroplasticity is the reason why they're true. So let's dive into a little bit more exactly what neuroplasticity is and think about what it does for us in cultivating resilience. So to do that, I've got a little bit of an analogy here. So let's say that you need to go from point A to point B. So this is based out of Calgary. This is a cycling road that I take fairly regularly. And you can see that there's a particular route here. And let's say for whatever reason, I need to switch where I'm going on a day. So this would involve, so instead of going from here, I'd be going more towards the downtown area. Now, anyone that's looking at this map can realize this is not the most efficient way that you could potentially go. You're actually going quite a ways out of your way. And according to Google Maps, I'm adding an extra 7 minutes onto my journey. So that's not the best way. But when we start learning a new route in our brain, we literally have to start to rewire ourselves, and we use our previous habits and behaviors as kind of the formation for new ones. So while initially we might start with this, overly long route, eventually we can realize like, oh, actually there's a different route, and we can actually use different pathways within our brain to accomplish the same goal or to accomplish different goals. And that's basically the concept of neuroplasticity, is this idea that we can rewire our brain based on our experience to be more adaptive, to learn from our experiences much more effectively. So then the question that I will pose for everyone, and I'll just have everyone type into the chat, is what are some adaptations that you've had to make over the course of the last year? So some positive adaptations that you've had to make, that you've had to implement into your life. Working out at home, yeah. So I imagine there's a very different approach to working out at home versus working out in a gym. You don't have all the same equipment. You might not, if you use a personal trainer, you might not have access to that. As a potentially a perk, you don't have to share your equipment with anyone else at home, or at least like very few other people. Living the same space as someone else all the time. That's another big adaptation. I feel very fortunate that I get along with all my roommates, because if I didn't, that could lead towards some burnouts. They don't have their commute as an opportunity to listen to podcasts and other sorts of things. So yeah, the fact that our commute has been removed from us is one other adaptation we've had to make. So all these different adaptations that we've all listed in the chat, these are all things that we've had to use neuroplasticity in order to implement. So the next question then becomes, what exactly is happening in our brain at a very biological level to facilitate these adaptations that we've done? So neuroplasticity quite literally involves the growth of new neurons, involves the formation of new synapses. So a really key hormone that's involved in neuroplasticity is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's often referred to as a BDNF. So what is depicted on the slide here is actually a stain of individual neurons. So in the top, you've got just a normal neuron, and at the bottom, you've got a neuron that's had BDNF added to it. And you can see it's got a lot more growth happening on it. It's almost like a plant in the sense it's got all these new vines and tendrils coming out, except instead of vines and tendrils, they're new connections with other neurons that allow information to go through different roads and pathways within our brain. Neuroplasticity is at a very concrete anatomical level, is our ability to rewire the connections between our individual brain cells. But then this can lead up towards the psychological level, where it allows us to take on new behaviors. But one thing that is really important to remember is that neuroplasticity isn't necessarily a one size fits all solution to everything. So we know that the stress and the burnout that we can be experienced, this can actually decrease levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, in particular key brain regions such as the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And this can lead us towards mental health outcomes like depression or anxiety. But when we're under these high degrees of stress and we've got lots of chronic inflammation, this can also increase BDNF levels in an area called the nucleus accumbens that's really heavily involved in addiction. Meaning that there can be a dark side to neuroplasticity as well. So it's not necessarily we want more neuroplasticity, it's that we want there to be neuroplasticity that's paired with positive learning experiences. And that this is what can lead us towards cultivating resilience. And there's actually been quite a bit of research done that a lot of the antidepressant medications that are available on the market, it's not necessarily that they do anything to reverse depression. Yes, they do boost your serotonin levels, but the serotonin level gets boosted immediately after taking them, whereas the therapeutic benefit doesn't happen usually for a couple of weeks. So one of the leading theories is these antidepressant medications are actually just increasing our neuroplasticity. There's been some really cool animal work done to suggest that that's actually the case. So this means that whether you're getting it from a pharmaceutical approach or you're getting it from more lifestyle-based interventions, neuroplasticity is a fundamental component of recovery. And what we can do is really try to pair that neuroplasticity with positive supporting learning experiences that help us really achieve our utmost potential, really cultivate that resilience. So some examples of how we can do that. This one might not seem very obvious as a follow from burnout, but stress management. When we have all that chronic cortisol floating throughout our body, this can actually make it more difficult for our brain to synthesize BDNF. And as a result, we're not going to be able to engage in the new learning that we need nearly as effectively as we otherwise would be. So, having good stress management practices, really allowing ourselves to have that time for recovery, to get back down to our baseline before we experience stress again, be really crucial for building up our resilience and our neuroplasticity. New learning. So when we learn new information, we're literally creating new brain pathways in order to facilitate that new information, and that critically involves BDNF. So if we're constantly trying to engage in new learning, we're kind of already priming our brain to have lots of BDNF floating around to facilitate that. And then that can then help out with other things. So instead of just reading a book, this could actually help out with learning new habits and being able to incorporate those. So this all kind of comes together. So if we're able to, constantly be engaging in lifelong learning, this is one good way to have just a baseline level of resilience going on in our lives. Sleep is another really important one. So BDNF is actually a growth hormone that is in large parts released while we're sleeping, particularly during deep sleep. So if we're having really interrupted sleep, if we're not getting into our deep sleep, then we're not getting as much of the BDNF benefit that we otherwise could be. And anyone that's gone a couple days with chronic sleep knows that they're not as effective at being able to learn new information, and they're probably going to have some relapses on some of their habits. So that all kind of comes together. We need to be mindful not just about how we're actively doing for our resilience, but what we're doing in our off time, in this case, sleep. Diet is another thing that can impact our potential for neuroplasticity. There is one particular nutrient, tryptophan, is an amino acid that's a building block for serotonin, which in turn can help out with the release of BDNF and neuroplasticity. So if you don't have enough of tryptophan with your diet, this is actually putting a physical limit on the amount of neuroplasticity that you can experience. So this really argues on why it's critical to have a nice, healthy diet, again, for that foundation for resilience. Unfortunately, I'm not a dietitian to go into much of the details of that. So, get talk to a dietitian to figure out how you can change your diet, but just know that overall it's really important. And then finally, we've got exercise. Typically, in an evolutionary context, when we engage in some sort of physical activity, there's a learning experience that come with it. Hopefully, we had just escaped from some predators, or we'd been chasing down some prey and we're not successful. So one kind of evolutionary mechanism we have is every time we engage in physical activity, our brain actually releases a little BDNF. And this is one of the reasons why physical activity is such a benefit for us, is because it is literally giving our brain the opportunity to become more flexible. From that evolutionary way of being able to learn from those experiences, this is now something that, even though we're not running away from predators anymore, we're not chasing prey, we still have this biological machinery in our brain. So using physical activity is a key way that we can really get our BDNF levels up and make sure that we've got a baseline level of neuroplasticity to promote our resilience. So that's kind of the end of the formal discussion for today. I just want to do a quick recap of what we've covered so far. So again, thinking about resilience as the ability to channel stress for adaptability. Stress is necessary for us to develop resilience, but if we want to experience resilience as opposed to burnout, this means we need to make some changes to our own personal behaviors, as well as, if possible, some changes to the systems in which we're operating in. And that can all lead towards us collectively being able to cultivate resilience, but then also being able to think that there are different people than how they respond to stress. There's some people that are dandelions that are just overall a little less sensitive to stress. They're probably going to be okay. But there's also orchid people where they're going to be more sensitive to stress, but if they're in a nice supportive environment, they've actually got some of the highest growth potential and can really, if you want to think about it from an investment, they can really return back on their investment from all those resources put into them. And that these two types of people can be very complementary, as we learned from our discussion group. And then finally, this idea of neuroplasticity, that in order to become adaptable, we need the biological machinery to actually rewire our brain. And then a few strategies that we can have to do that is really having good stress management in place, constantly engaging in lifelong learning, making sure that we're getting enough sleep, making sure that our diet contains all the nutrients that we critically need, and having regular exercise. And if we do those 5 things, then we're going to have a good baseline level of neuroplasticity that's going to allow us to really take all the stress that we're currently experiencing and be able to channel it into resilience rather than leading it towards burnout and all the negative health consequences that can come as a result of that. So, that being said, I want to wrap it up and give Lisa an opportunity to talk about our resilience roadmap we offer Conscious Works.
Yeah, so one of our new products to support teams and give leaders the tools they need to support these key areas that Ty just talked about in a really practical way. So going well beyond education and giving a set of tools of really actionable, quick items, and also providing the opportunity of live sessions. It also has a complete systematic survey and impact survey for the program, so you can see how your team's doing at different time points during the year. We've taken this, and it's a very, as I mentioned, systematic approach versus this let's see what we can do for people's mental health. It really builds with behavior change science, the neuroscience, and the practical things as you go through the program. We also have a mastermind that everybody's invited to for next month, where it helps leaders think through this. So how can I apply this information? What can I do with my team? What are struggles that I'm facing right now? Thank you guys so much for coming. Again, if you have any questions about the Resilience Roadmap or anything that we do here at Conscious Works, reach out. Always up for a virtual coffee. I will talk to you guys later. Have a great rest of day.